Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton, a man that needs no introduction, but thank you for your presence here tonight.
Thank you. Always happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, we live in contentious times. We've been through the electoral cycle. There's a lot of tension in the world, and it's not unusual to hear in some circles, well, the country is so divided. I'm really worried that we may have some kind of civil war again. I hope that doesn't happen, but I'm just worried about it, and people may say that. And do you have some observations on that? I mean, apparently there are conditions that are needed for civil war, civil conflict. And an example might be the conflict in Ethiopia right now. And you could say, in a way, that the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians is kind of a civil war, being you could say pretty much the same people.
Well, certainly interspersing of the cultures there and the languages.
Yes, yes.
I was just recently reading, and if I may, I'm going to pull out my cell phone right here and just refresh myself, because there was recently an article in the Guardian by Barbara F. Walter, not Barbara Walters, but Barbara F. Walter, who is a professor out in a university somewhere in California, and her specialty is writing about the conditions that make civil war more likely. And there are just a few things I wanted to point out here. I mean, 34% of Americans surveyed earlier this year that it's okay to use violence against the government sometimes. More than 40% said that they believe civil war was at least somewhat likely in the next 10 years. There's some others that suggest that they feel that something awful is about to happen. So now she's writing from the perspective of the left. She sees the right as the major threat here.
Yes.
But with that proviso, I think what she says is very interesting, because I've given a lot of thought to this. I've long been interested in the United States Civil War, and not just the war itself, but how we bumbled into it. And so I've given a lot of thought to that myself, and I found it reassuring, validating that she had spotted in her research a lot of the things that I had been considering. We differ on some areas, especially in her prescription for stopping this war.
Well, what is her way to stop the threat?
Well, we'll get to that, and I think we need to get to that, but I think it would make more sense if we start by looking at the conditions that she suggests. And it's essentially, if I had to summarize it, a refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the current administration, perhaps even the current regime, and I think you really see this in the election deniers of the last few years. The idea that that Trump believe and the MAGA people believe that the election was stolen from Trump, and that he was really the rightfully elected president, and that it was an election fraud, and so that Biden is not the legitimate president. Now, I think the biggest election denial right now is clearly coming from the far right. It's coming from the Trumpists and the Make America Great Again people. But I have to hasten to add that the left is not without blame on this as well. Stacey Abrams in the last gubernatorial election, who I don't think ever conceded, and she claimed that the fix was in at the Secretary of State's office. And so she said, all right, I'm going to quit fighting, but I'm not conceding that I lost. If you go back to 2016, the vicious attack by the Democrats on the Electoral College, not necessarily that it was illegal, but it was unfair. And you heard the Democrats saying of Donald Trump over and over again, not my president, he's not mine. And the fact that if you go all the way back to 2000, the Democrats have strongly denounced the the machinery that produced Republicans' victory. The 2000 election. They say that this was trickery. The Supreme Court, the fix was in there, and so for the last 20 plus years, you've seen this. Our elected officials, there's something not quite legitimate about them. Now, once again, I think this has come to a head with the MAGA election deniers, but that's a very strong indication of it. That in turn leads to this belief that, well, if it's not a legitimate government, then shouldn't we be allowed to use violence against it? I mean, that's the American tradition, the Boston Tea Party, for instance, Lexington and Concord. If you want to add to that, when you see police obviously throwing their authority around in illegal ways, and George Floyd comes to mind immediately, then the idea that the police are the illegitimate enforcers of an illegitimate regime, you see where all this is going. And so this is where she's coming from, and I think there's a lot of truth to it.
Well, we could bounce the basketball a little bit on that. The one thing is that if you vote, if you actually go to the trouble to do that, then in some ways you want your vote to be counted, and you are saying, because you've participated in the process, well, for better or worse, I have some obligation to accept the verdict of the ballot box. And the problem is when people don't vote, which in many ways groups have not done that in the past. So I'm not going to vote. It won't do me any good, and it's a difficult process. I've got my life to live, and the vote is to have to stand in the rain for 2 hours, or I can't eat any hamburgers there. I have to stay 6 feet apart from people. Whatever the story is, and it takes 14 hours to do it. So, but if people actually do that, they put their vote in, then I think it encourages acceptance of the verdict. The question, just to continue along those lines, many countries have a much higher turnout than in the U.S., and indeed some countries make it illegal not to vote. Yeah. Brazil is one of them. So if you're expected to vote, and so the turnouts in America are always on the low side. I mean, over 50%, and maybe they've increased, and some groups are notoriously do not vote. They avoid the ballot box for many reasons. But that, I think that's something to brood about. And just to go to the idea that, well, we don't accept I've voted, and the election is illegal and wrongful, and therefore it's my duty, my responsibility to cast out the demons. So I have an obligation to restore the country, you could say. The misnamed insurrection, I don't like that. It was really a riot. I kind
of concur with that.
An insurrection has the sense that there's a tremendous organization, that things have been put together, and it's a rhetorical overkill, which many people enjoy in just casual conversation about whatever. But I think those are some points to brood about that story, and so the corrective factor is to make sure that the elections are without any question correct and legal, and that as many people as possible vote. And the higher the turnout, the more likely that there won't be any aggrieved parties to some degree. I'll throw this out.
I partly agree with that. I may have lost track of what you said at the beginning, that the people who are more likely to vote are more likely to accept the outcome.
Yes.
I'm not sure I would agree with that. I would say if you're an apathetic voter and you don't vote much or you don't vote at all, then you feel either that you don't have a stake in it or that what you do doesn't matter, so why try? I mean, there's sort of a resigned acceptance. I think the problem is if I vote and I have this suspicion that the system is rigged so it will not count my vote, yeah, if the electoral machinery itself is not to be trusted, I think that is one of the really big signs. It's not an indispensable sign, but I think the more things you check off on the shopping list, the more that civil war is likely. And unfortunately, and we saw Trump talking about this in the rigged voting machines with the software written by Venezuela or something. There may be some truth to that, not to those voting machines, but the fact that it is so easy now to write code and to insert it in firmware, who really knows anymore? You've got keyloggers on your computers at home. You've got Trojan horses. You've got phishing attempts. So, whether or not it is true, the very specter that it raises, that some force out there, be it the other party or the Russians or whoever, is making sure that my vote isn't really counting. That means that if the side that I do not favor wins, they're suspect. That it's not a true reflection of the will of the American people. And that sails us into dangerous waters.
Another thing, I mean, I guess you'd say on each side would be the opposing party or opposing political group are so intrinsically evil that they just can't be allowed to have power.
And if they are that evil, then of course they are perfectly capable of messing up, of corrupting the electoral system so it feeds on
itself. Right, and they have evil intentions.
Yes.
To basically hurt, say, me or whatever. I'll use me as an example. But the individual voter might be the opposing party has some tremendous desire to injure me, and they're wicked people, and they've assumed this power, and there's a large philosophical justification for civil war on my side. It's a large philosophical reasoning behind that, and I think indeed the Civil War, the American Civil War, the states that succeeded, they had ample reason to do so because of the American War of Independence against Britain, and the Enlightenment ideas about when the Jeffersonian language in the Declaration of Independence is quite justifiable and indeed necessary. So to change the political apparatus, and the crucial thing, I think, would be group cohesion. So if you have a lot of groups that each perceive a group identity, and that the group's interests are not being adhered to, and their group has been injured, then the group can demand withdrawal, can demand their own space, their own country as far as that happens. And there are arguments out there about geographical boundaries and what would be a more appropriate boundary. I mean, the idea is, well, we'll just Tex-Mex, whatever. A good country would be Texas plus Monterey or whatever, or the northern Mexican states. I mean, or New England plus the maritime provinces. Maybe they've got cultural interest. So there are these stories out there with the groups having their own identity. And I'll make this point, is that we push the idea of, quote, diversity. I mean, that's the idea. And really, it's the summa bonum of a country. We don't want a homogeneous country. So a homogeneous country cannot be diverse. And all these bad things about having a homogeneous country, it's never quite been said what the bad things are, but It's just said diversity. That means many different people, many different groups. And the assumption is that all those groups are going to be like the fascist sticks, sort of just bound together. They'll be stronger. So we have 50 or 100 groups in the country. They all get along great, and they'll make the country stronger. Right, and that's the assumption without exploring it much. But many different groups are there, and I think the general thrust of where the Civil War tensions happen would be on the basis of the political parties. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party each could carve out different sections of the country as their home provinces. And for instance, some states are really always go Republican, some always Democrat, and that's causing a lot of the tension.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack in what you've said. I guess the first thing I would say is that if you look at the American Revolution and the U.S. Civil War, there was a very strong geographic component to both of those. That you had the North American colonies that were separated from Europe by 3,000 miles of ocean, different ecosystem, different economic basis, and no representation. The United States Civil War, slavery, which is, of course, was an agricultural labor institution, and therefore it was strongest in the warm climate and the long growing seasons. I think you're absolutely right, and Dr. Walter agrees with you that my group, my unit, my community is being threatened somehow, and she specifically talks about white, conservative, ethnic, traditional America, the main demographic for MAGA, which is feeling threatened by the browning of America and left-wing policies. She points out very accurately, and I agree with this, I've always agreed with it, it's not going to be clean cut anymore. Now, yes, there are redder parts of the country and bluer parts, but it's not clean cut anymore. The difference is ideological, it's not geographical. And so the idea of parts of the country seceding are less likely. I think we may see
I think it is less likely, but I mean,
we may see a secession.
Really?
Yeah. If the Texas economy is doing great and the federal government is refusing to police the Texas border with Mexico and refusing to let Texas police it, I can see at some point Texas saying, to heck with this. The federal government, being part of the union is not helping us at all. Or if California, so I'm not ruling it out, but I don't think the Civil War that we will see will have that kind of component. It will be more of a guerrilla warfare. It will be a warfare against our elected officials, fighting in the streets, irregular warfare, to say the least. I will say that we can be diverse as we like, as long as we agree that the game is more important than individual players. That we have to find common ground with the other groups with whom we ideologically disagree, and that common ground is the idea of the rule of law and tolerance for people who are different from us. And once again, if you say the system has been co-opted by our enemy, that the game is rigged, then that common ground is impossible, and that makes the Civil War once again more likely.
There are a lot of conflicts. Is certainly in the human gene arrangements, the way we're put together. We fight. It's be very unusual to find humans that have never had conflict with each other, and just the conflict resolution is a big deal. Traditionally, the idea was that what happened in the New World, that Europeans came in, mostly from Western Europe, you could say that, and they sort of dominated. They had the cultural ability to dominate the thousands of square miles here. All the indigenous populations were injured by their presence, you could say that. And they created their own ecosystem, their own cultural arrangements, their own ideology, their own justification for what's up. And that stayed, it was kind of hammered out, I think, by fighting with traditional enemies. So one thing that prevents internal civil war, in a way, is having some kind of big external enemy, so everyone can sort of get on the same page. And you could see the American, after the Civil War, in many ways, the way the country was bound up again, we're fighting common enemies, fighting the Spanish-American War, in which Confederate generals had another.
Joe Wheeler of Georgia.
had another run at it.
Yeah.
And
Joe Wheeler said during the Battle of Kettle Hill, "We've got the Yankees on the run." In 1898,
it was pretty amusing. And then in all these wars, so the country was pulled together by external enemies, and in a way, the unrecognized, when the Soviet Union blew up, the communists went down, and the U.S. won, then the external pressure on our national identity went away, and these centrifugal forces emerged. And if you think about it, it's incredibly difficult to put 350 million people here all together with so many differences, so many different backgrounds, and can we put a melting pot there? The idea was, I think, espoused in the early 20th century, well, we're all going to melt. We'll all be one. In fact, the word was coined in New York City. I can't quite recollect. It may be a play, I think. Maybe a play.
That sounds familiar to me.
Yeah. So they were all going to melt together and be one great people. And actually, you don't hear that talk much, do you?
No, you do hear talk about the salad bowl. There are a bunch of things poured in.
Right. And so, no, our national identity, we're not going to become the same people. We're going to maintain our differences.
Yes.
And indeed, we're going to have multiple citizenships. Another thing, if you're trying to say, well, we're all going to melt together or be one people, the idea that people can have many different passports, and they can be citizens of many different places. And this is just one of a number of places that they are a citizen. So it certainly changes a lot of the country's dynamics.
Yes. The good Dr. Walter does say that, talking about group cohesion, and once again, she's writing from a somewhat leftist perspective, but she says one of the strongest types of group cohesion, and we are seeing it today, is ethnic cohesion. And so once again, she comes back to the sort of you talked about the fascist idea, but remember, all the fascisti were all Italians.
Yeah.
All the Germans, the good Aryan Übermenschen, and so white middle class America produces this kind of nationalistic fervor, which becomes intolerant of other ethnicities, other types of cultural expression, and so that's very dangerous. And I think she's absolutely right about that. I mean, it was that demographic that rioted on Capitol Hill, and that was a scary moment. Yeah, I agree. It was not an insurrection, but it was.
It was an unpleasant riot.
It was a scary moment. Yeah. I think she ignores the other side of it, though. The idea that the left tends to have an internationalist or globalist approach to what we might call human rights or fundamental rights. And this is a threat to the Westphalian idea. I mean, Westphalian sovereignty wasn't, we will have our life and you'll have your life, and we are perfectly happy with that. The Westphalian notion of sovereignty is, here in our state we will do things our way, and we will let you do things your way, not because we approve of it, not because we like this diversity, but because we don't have the power to bump you off. And it's just a fact of life, and we have to accept it. if we go back to our Civil War, you had the white South saying to the white North with their fundamental universal human rights, okay, you don't like slavery? Don't own slaves, but don't come down here and tell us we can't own slaves. You stay up there and do things your way, but don't come down and interfere with our domestic institutions. And it was this abolitionist idea that Westphalian sovereignty is outmoded. It doesn't matter, that all human beings are entitled to these universal rights that the slave owner Jefferson wrote about 80 years ago, means we're not going to let you do it your way because it's immoral, it is wrong. So we're not going to leave you alone. And so it's sort of a two to tango situation here. And so we're getting pressure from both sides and an attack on the legitimacy of the officials from both sides that's going to lead to some really nasty stuff in our future, I think.
Well, I mean, Westphalia, it was at the end of the 30 Years' War. Is
yes,
that
correct.
the story? And the idea is that, well, we're going to have a lot of little kingdoms, and in each kingdom, the ruler will determine things a lot, but it'll all be homogeneous as far as religion goes or whatever. And the boundary, if you live in a little kingdom, then that's what you are. You're
Yes.
a Lutheran or you're Catholic or whatever.
And it was not, and it was not the choice. It was just after the end of this disastrous,
No more
horribly
war.
destructive war that neither Catholicism nor Protestantism had the raw power or the mandate to bump the other one off. It was a live and let live out of necessity.
Well, I don't really think we're going to have a civil war here, but it does bring up some of the difficulties that our country faces and how we resolve that. So we're obviously headed to some kind of new national identity, which is I think it's painful and it's difficult to do that. And so many people are wedded to the older ideas of what the country was or is, and to the older ideas of the nation state, USA, people like saying that. But it may well be, for many reasons, that the nation state is going to be altered a lot, and life in the America won't be the same as it was in the past, for better or worse. What, you have any other final thought on any of this?
Well, yeah, I think that once again, and I'm not envisioning, and Walter is not envisioning a blue versus the gray, two
Right,
massive
right.
armies. It's just taking it to the street. It's more of a Stalingrad kind of fighting that just goes on forever. And I think it's exacerbated by the fact that unlike our Civil War of the 1860s, small numbers of individuals can pack a huge amount of firepower today. Full automatic weapons, assault rifles, the ability to make nerve gas in people's basements. We saw that done in Japan 20 years ago. So it doesn't take a very big group to make a huge amount of trouble. I don't know where it goes, but I don't think it's going to be pleasant. I think her remedy for it, and once again it's aimed at the right because she's writing from the perspective of the left, is to censor all this violent speech on the internet that whips it up. And the classical liberal in me just recoils at that idea. But of course I'm operating out of the basic notion that people are reasonable and can be reasoned with, and as we discussed in a recent episode, maybe that is not true.
Well, on that note, Buck, we try and be as reasonable as we can in our little interchanges. But so, thank you for coming. We'll
Thank you,
talk
sir.
some more. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.